Britain and the Americans had explored the Oregon country in the late 1700s by sea, but it was the Mackenzie expedition for the British and the Lewis and Clark expedition for the Americans that gave both sides a legitimate claim to the region. While a legal declaration of claim to an unsettled region established a foundation of law for that claim, what the colonizing nation always knew was that if you don't get a large group of people in a region to establish farms and settlements and establish a militia to defend those settlements, then a claim to a region is worth no more than the paper it is written on. America wasted no time getting settlers into the Oregon Territory. The Oregon country was made up of the present-day states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming and Montana, and also the Canadian province of British Columbia. John Jacob Astor was the first American to make a play toward establishing a presence in the region by establishing a fort near the mouth of the Columbia River. His American Fur Trading Company challenged the monopoly of the recently merged Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Fur Company. Mountain men scattered out through the Cascades and the Coast Range, trapping and trading with the northwestern Indian tribes for beaver skins. Some trappers retired from their trade and became farmers in the river valleys of Oregon, and many more came in from the east over the Oregon Trail to establish farms, raise their families, and make their fortunes. Lands outside the river valley was very rugged. River transportation was necessary for the fur traders, farmers, and later lumbermen to get their products to local markets and to seaports for export to other regions. Three types of boats used on the rivers of the Northwest were screw drive, having a propeller, stern wheelers, and side wheelers. Screw drive boats required the boat to be deeper running, and the Northwest rivers didn't have gently sloping, silty, sandy shorelines to drive the bow upon for landing steamboats. Side wheelers were difficult to dock with a side to the wharf. This fact, and the fact that stern wheelers were more maneuverable, made the stern wheeler the most popular boat in the northwestern rivers. Ocean-going vessels could travel up the Columbia River as far as Portland, where the Willamette River met the Columbia. Rapids at present-day Clackamas on the Willamette were a hazard to navigation. Above those rapids, the Hudson Bay Company established the first settlement upstream from Astoria and named it Oregon City. A portage was necessary around Willamette Falls, at which Oregon City was established. Cargo would be transferred from boats plying the upper river to those plying the lower river, and vice versa. This photo shows a stern whaler docked at Corvallis on the upper Willamette River. Foreign nations originally had aspirations for the Oregon country. Besides the United States and Britain, the Spanish to the south wanted it as an extension of California, and Russia to the north wanted it as an extension of Alaska. The Adams-Onis Treaty that provided for the purchase of Florida and the western part of the state of Louisiana also set the northern boundary of California at the 42nd parallel of latitude. The Russo-American Treaty and the Russo-British Treaty established the Alaskan border at 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude. The British and Americans had decided to peacefully share the region until a boundary could be mutually decided on. In 1844, James K. Polk ran as a manifest destiny expansionist with the platform of annexing Texas and all of Oregon. The battle cry of the Manifest Destiny Hawks was 54, 40, or fight. To avoid war with Britain and Spain simultaneously, Polk chose to settle on the 49th parallel, an expansion of the boundary between the Great Lakes and Continental Divide as the boundary between the United States and Canada. Paddle wheel assisted sailing vessels plied the waters of the Columbia before the steamboats became common, but they could only go as far upstream as Portland. The Snake River was navigable up to Lewiston, and 5 boats made their way up to haul ore from a mine. 2 of those were the Lewiston and the Spokane. This photo is of the wreck of the Pioneer SS Beaver, the first steamboat of the Pacific Rivers. It was built in England and was delivered to Oregon City in 1836 to service the fur industry. In my youth, I lived for a few months in the town of St. Helens, Oregon. From my apartment window, I could see the Columbia River. When it wasn't too rainy or foggy, I could actually see the state of Washington on the far bank. On clear days, which were very few, I could actually see Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, and Mount Hood. The Coast Range provides a wall on the sides of the river that make it one of the most beautiful rivers on which to travel. The Pioneer SS Beaver belonged to the Hudson Bay Company and was used to service Hudson Bay facilities throughout the Oregon country, including the Puget Sound and the Fraser River. The Fraser River Gold Rush and the Caribou Gold Rush of 1862 would bring more steamboats from the Columbia River in Oregon to Puget Sound and the Fraser River. Steamboats answering the call to serve the miners were the Surprise, Enterprise, and the Wilson G. Hunt. The Wilson G. Hunt had served the 49er Gold Rush in California. Another gold rush would make steamboats part of the subarctic landscape. Seward's Folly was the name given to the purchase of Russian America, which brought into America's possession a vast wilderness 1/5 the size of the contiguous United States. In 1897, gold was discovered in the Klondike, and the Americans decided that the Alaskan Purchase wasn't such a bad deal after all. Alaska would become a major producer of oil and gas and would be of major strategic importance in both World War II and the Cold War. The interior of Alaska was difficult to inhabit because of a large mountain range separating coastal Alaska from the Yukon Basin. The gold rush provided a motivation for inhabiting the Alaskan interior, and the steamboat provided the transportation of needed supplies and moved people the long distances between the widely scattered villages. This photo is of a Yukon River workboat similar to the first steamboat on the lower Yukon. The first was the Steamboat Wilder, and it was used in the running of wire for the Collins Overland Telegraph Company. The discovery of gold on Rabbit Creek near Dawson in the Yukon Territory of Canada triggered a rush of not just men wanting to get rich, but steamboat operators as well. Boats left the Pacific Northwest for the Yukon, and shipyards in Seattle, Victoria, Portland, and Vancouver all built boats for the Klondike trade. 300 steamboats would ply the waters of the Yukon over the years. The year 1900 would see the completion of the White Pass and Yukon Route narrow gauge railroad. This route between Whitehorse, the capital of the Canadian Yukon, and Skagway gave the steamboats a shorter route in delivering their cargoes to a seaport. White Pass, a Canadian company, took over the biggest steamboat operator on the lower Yukon in 1914, the Northern Navigation Company. From 1914 to 1921, White Pass served 2,000 miles of rivers and lakes, plying tributaries of the Yukon to reach towns such as Fairbanks on the Tanana River. The lower Yukon boats operated as a subsidiary known as the American Yukon Navigation Company, while the upper Yukon boats operated under Canadian registry. The last steamboat to ply the lower Yukon River was the Tanana in 1954. The Klondike II made its last journey on the upper Yukon in 1955. In August of 1960, the Keno did a run from Whitehorse to Dawson under its own power, making it the last steam-powered vessel to operate under its own power on the Yukon. It was being moved to a location where it would be put on display. The Tanana, Klondike II, and the Keno are all museums today.